When I first heard about the Nikon Z6 III, I honestly wasn't much of a huge fan. I heard about the partially stacked sensor, which has some benefits like faster readouts, and some cons, which is apparently worse dynamic range. But then I had a pretty ridiculous thought. What if I tried the camera for myself and ignored the internet? So that's what I did. I've been trying this camera out for a couple months. I shot some engagement photography, filmed an awesome hip-hop concert, as well as gathered some tests and various dad footage so that I could compile this review together of the Nikon Z6 III from the perspective of a moron. This video is sponsored by Professional Photographers of America. More on that in a minute. All right, let's talk about the good stuff first, and we can't ignore the price tag. $2,500 as of recording this video. The photography shooting experience is amazing on this camera, and actually when I took this thing to a photography engagement photo session me and my wife did, that's where I started to love this camera. Honestly, for photography, this camera shines. You get 24.5 partially stacked pics, which if you don't know what that means, you don't have to worry about it. The photos look great. And honestly, Nikon just has the photography experience nailed. That's something I've been learning this year as I've been trying more Nikon cameras like the ZF, which I miss. Like the body itself just feels premium. The grip is nice and deep. It's rugged. You feel like you could like drop this thing in mud and it would be fine. I haven't done a mud test, but my son does crap his pants a lot, so I guess that's close as I can get. The buttons actually feel premium quality, very dense, like weighted. It has a nipple dial, which we all love. The screen too, even when you flip it out, like this thing stays in place. It's nice and robust. Even twisting the screen has a nice amount of like resistance to it. It feels premium. The whole camera design just feels very high quality. I love it. If there is a downside to the build, I would say that it's this not being a spin dial right here. I would have loved to set my ISO to this, but it's just 4 buttons. And to change your ISO, you can just click down on the ISO button and then spin the dial, which isn't that bad. It's something you just get used to really quickly. But I don't know, I like extra spinny things. I've had a great time using this camera for photography, and the way that I keep my photography work safe is with my friends at Professional Photographers of America, today's sponsor. And don't skip this, because at the end I'm going to talk to you about how we might be able to hang out soon. With PPA, you can protect your photography work by having access to their indemnification trust. Basically, you can contact PPA if you have issues with data loss. You can also contact them if you have issues with a client. More than that, I can get contract templates, and my favorite perk is that you get up to $15,000 of gear, equipment, insurance. There's another exciting thing coming up. PPA's big conference every year, Imaging USA, in February of 2025, and I'm going to be there hanging out as a PPA ambassador. Check out the links in the description to become a PPA member and also to check out Imaging USA 2025. Hope to see you guys there. But now let's talk about another Nikon Z6 III Pro, the video shooting experience. I just gotta say, this camera is a true hybrid beast. It's actually great at photography and video, and I feel like that's kind of tough for companies to pull off in the past few years. It's either like the camera's really good at photography and pretty good at video, or the other way around. First of all, you get absolutely ridiculous resolution and frame rate options in this camera. You can shoot in H.264, H.265, internal ProRes HQ, internal ProRes RAW, and internal NRAW. One of my favorite things about the video on this camera is it does full frame 4K up to 60 frames per second. And yes, you can do that in ProRes. You can also get 4K 100 and 120 frames per second in ProRes and the other shooting modes too. But 100 and 120 frames per second have a significant crop on the sensor. It's still cool to have that option, but I'm just so glad this has at least 4K 60 full frame. You can also shoot in 6K in various modes on this camera. If you're shooting in NRAW, you can do 6K up to 60 frames per second. That's the only mode that allows you to get 6K 60, which is ridiculous, but it's there if you need it. If you're shooting in a lower quality mode than NRAW, you can do 6K up to 30 frames per second. So you can shoot 6K 24 if you want, and then put that on your 4K timeline for a little bit of extra downsampling to punch in on your footage if it's like an interview and you want to try to get 2 angles out of it. 6K is actually extremely useful. Nikon's Z8 camera shoots 8K. That's honestly overkill for anything I would do right now, but 6K is a really nice option to have because it's not too ridiculous with file sizes, but it's just enough extra resolution where you can make it look like you have an extra camera angle out of one shot, which is really nice. Overall, I would say the IBIS isn't my favorite out of different brands out there. I think Lumix is still probably the best in my opinion, but this is pretty solid, especially if you're just standing still. Like if you're filming something in the back of a room, like a concert, then this will actually stabilize your footage really well. But once you start introducing a decent amount of motion or like movement, it looks a little bit jarring in some shots, but overall it's solid. If Lumix is S tier, I would say that Nikon Z6 III, it's probably about B tier. The autofocus is another thing I'm putting in the pros section of this video because it is reliable, especially if you're doing a like human subject or auto subject detect mode. I turned up the speed by a little bit, I think +2 on the speed, and it was able to track with me relatively well using a native Nikon lens. I was using the 35 1.4 and it honestly did a pretty dang good job. But as soon as I turned off subject detect mode and just had it in like a zone in the middle, it actually really struggled. I don't know exactly what's going on with Nikon's autofocus. I got solid results when I was telling the camera, hey, you need to focus on a person. But once I took that away and just left it on autofocus full time, center zone, it struggled a bit more. And I noticed this really weird thing that I had to jiggle the object in front of the camera and it would actually autofocus faster than if I just put an object in front of my face. Like with my Sony, I can just do this and it's pretty much perfect every single time. Not the case with Nikon. The autofocus is not perfect by any means, but it's workable. Last two pros are the battery life, which is just really good on this camera, even in the higher recording modes. And the Z6 III doesn't seem to have any serious overheating issues, despite the fact that it does not have an internal fan. Now, the peeves. Okay, we got to address this first one that everybody has beat to death, which is the dynamic range. Because this camera is a partially stacked sensor, like I said earlier, you get faster readout speeds, which is good for rolling shutter and burst modes and stuff like that, at the sacrifice of dynamic range. And this is where people love to get pixel PP, flash some charts on the screen for you. Did I say PP earlier? I'm sorry about that. PP. Oh man, it's been a rough day. I actually needed that. Comment thank you for saying PP if you made it this far in the video. So I put this camera in a real world environment. We've been editing these photos and Nikon's RAW is just really nice to work with. Everything looks beautiful. The colors are amazing. I had enough dynamic range to pull the highlights back from the sky. In a real world scenario and with some editing, it looks good. Voiceover Zach here to show you how to work around the dynamic range issues in video and noise performance as well. Let's start with dynamic range. So I have this extreme case here where I'm decently exposed, but my background window is destroyed. First of all, if this was a professional shoot, I would have light in the room hitting the subject to bring up the overall ambience so this isn't being blown out. But it's kind of fun to go through an extreme case and just see if we can salvage it. Shout out to Jake Hayden for his custom node tree. I'm just ripping from him. Okay, so now this is just my CSTs to get my shot to Rec 709 basically. So I'm actually just gonna show you guys a pretty dramatic curve that you can do to kind of alleviate the issues over here where these highlights are clipping pretty bad. So basically, I'm just gonna start tweaking this a little bit so that window's looking a little softer. Sometimes I do something a little bit buck wild like this. Basically, it smooths out the clipping over here and brings this overall exposure down. Obviously, there's not really detail here, but it looks better than just like completely blowing it out like this. You can also map your HDR wheels to be set to N-Log if you'd like, and then you can try to further adjust the HDR settings to see if you can get even better results with this. So, I mean, right there, before and after, this doesn't look amazing, but for an extreme case, it's not bad. And then I can kind of throw my extra sauce on top of it that I usually do. And obviously this isn't perfect, but I mean, from before to after, that's a salvageable shot in an extremely difficult dynamic range scenario. Now let's talk about noise performance. This camera does have noise issues, specifically color noise I've noticed, even when you're at the native ISO. So this is 800 ISO. Let me turn noise reduction off and do a little pixel peepage with, oh my, where are you going? You can see there is quite a bit of color noise on this kid, who is my son. But if I kick this noise reduction node on, it does clean up relatively nice, but you can see I have a ton of chroma being taken out of this. So it's cranked up to 80 right now, and before there's quite a bit of chroma noise in these shadows. I also usually have a node right here that takes away a little bit of the harsh digital texture of cameras, and that seems to help smooth things out as well. So without those two nodes, it looks like that. Like over here, this is 800 ISO. This shot is slightly underexposed, but that looks gnarly down here. But if I turn these two nodes back on, that looks a lot more manageable. And from a distance, which is how people are gonna be watching it, This looks like a nice shot. Just like any camera, this one has its limitations. I do wish the sensor had less noise on it for sure, even in the native ISOs. When you're out shooting in daylight, you're probably not going to see anything. And if you add a little bit of noise reduction to your shot, it's totally manageable. Another huge con is this camera only writes video to one card. If you are like me and you're concerned with like that hyper reliability of your footage, this is not the camera for you, I don't think. Two more cons. One is it does 6K 60 only in NRAW, like I mentioned. I think they should just open that up to as many modes as possible. Maybe, I don't know. It feels like they're just trying to get you to use NRAW, but I don't really want to shoot in RAW. So there's that one, and the camera also has a record limit of 125 minutes at a time. All right, final thoughts and who's this camera for? One group of people is Nikon shooters who want to stay in the Z mount system, but they need an affordable full frame camera that's amazing for either photo or video. Yes, it has quirks, but if you're willing to creatively look past those and figure out ways around them, then you're gonna get insane results with this thing, and it's not gonna break the bank as much. And if you're just looking for an amazing hybrid camera and you wanna try out Nikon and not bust your bank, check out the Z6 III. Text me when you get home so I know you're safe. Comment below what cameras and tech you guys want me to check out. Watch out for deer, because around Halloween time, they like to horn people off. And you are loved much more than you may even know. All right, God bless you guys. See you soon.
Pee-pee.